You maybe got an outline of the service this morning in terms of just in terms of a program. And inside there actually is a message outline for you if you want to follow along. It has scriptures. We're going to be looking at Genesis 50, particularly at the end of this service. And the reason why I'm noting it now, because many times, and I know Pastor Scott and I grew up in kind of the same environment in terms of what you do, usually talk about a text, read a text and then talk about a text. I'm going to read that particular text nearing the end because I want to put that text, that chapter from the first book of the Bible, Genesis, and chapter 50, I want to put it in its context. So taking the text, sometimes you don't know what's actually going on unless you take a wider lens. And so we're going to take it in terms of this context. And so come to that in that way. I also love the fact that you're in a series right now of what it means to say, for me to understand the Bible, I'm helped by understanding some key characters of the Bible, some key people that help me understand the story of Jesus and his redemption, meaning that process by which God himself says, I know you are sinners, you've sinned against me, but I have a plan, and I'm going to show images of that plan through the lives of people so you really understand the life of Jesus. And so this morning we're going to go back to one of those people that is one of these key characters to understanding not only the Bible, but especially the ministry of Jesus. As already noted, we have a phrase that to think about. It's that phrase, all in. And maybe another way to say that is, it's commitment. Commitment. And I want to note that I've been in these moments, particularly this last summer, where I saw commitment in new ways again. I was privileged to serve as the officiant at a couple weddings, couple family weddings. And in fact, this morning, I'm pleased to say that, yes, I'm going to name you out there. There's Charles and Nicole. They got married in West Palm Beach, right along the kind of the piers there. And I was there. I was in the front row seat as they look at each other. And they're not looking at me. They're looking at each other. And this is a moment where they make a commitment to one another. They make a vow to one another. And if we could actually harness the energy of couples in that moment, we would have no energy crisis ever. I can guarantee you that. There's sparks that are flying. They look in each other's eyes, and this is a moment of commitment. But I've said, I'm sure Pastor Scott has said, that this is one way to measure commitment, but the real measure of commitment is not what's said on a wedding day, because every couple that I know has that great moment of commitment. But commitment really is shown in those other days when it's not so easy to say, I love you. When there's difficulties or struggles. That's why sometimes those traditional vows are in sickness and in health, richer or poor. They recognize the range of life and the fact that sometimes it's about understanding that commitment really shows up by just being there, day in and day out. A second image that our family had related to this notion of commitment being all in was coming together for my mother and father. They celebrated this past summer 60 years of marriage. 60 years. And it's something where we had all the children, grandchildren were all there, and they talked about that life, and we recounted some of those ups and downs of life. And there they are, 60 years and counting, speaking about what yet comes. And my mom especially, she said this, it kind of is a thank you for us all gathering. She says, we're glad you're here. We know the days ahead might not be so easy. And she's speaking about their health. And it's one of those moments where you recognize that no matter what happens, they're going to do this together. Commitment. Would you like to be known as a person of commitment? Would you like to be known as a person of purpose, focus, commitment? Would you like to be giving of yourself fully and completely to being an all-in person? What does that look like? And how do you measure? How do you measure if you are all in? This morning, we're going to look at the life of Joseph as a prism of this moment. Prism of this idea of purpose and focus and commitment. And I come to this particular Bible character, this person who really did live and loved and had so much going on in their life that there's a fullness to their story that makes their story in the Bible one of the longer stories of the Bible. And then it's summarized in a book called Hebrews. And after Jesus had died and resurrected, that there's a number of letters and stories, and one of those is from the book of Hebrews. And there at the end of that, nearing the end of that book, it highlights now you want to understand faith, you want to understand commitment. Here's a definition of faith. Now, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. And this is what the ancients were commended for. And then in this list, there is this phrasing about Joseph. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, when he was about to die, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. So there it is. And as the writer of Hebrews looks back and says, I want you to know that Joseph is in this cloud of witnesses and he's cheering you on. And if his life can help you understand purpose, focus, commitment, then look at the life of Joseph. And already there in that time, they would say to help you understand not only Joseph, but what Jesus did for us. The life of Joseph, though, is one of many twists and turns. There are films about this and different stories about how even parts of the life of Joseph are already a full movie by itself. The opening scene of the life of Joseph really comes in Genesis 37. He comes and he is this person who's, and I saw in terms of you focusing also on Abraham, especially at night. So he is the great-grandson of Abraham. There's Abraham. There's Isaac. Isaac had 2 children, and one of those is Jacob. And out of Jacob's family comes this person by the name of Joseph. And you need to know that Joseph is introduced as a favored son. He's a favored son because Jacob loved especially his mother. Now, once again, this is one of those stories that we don't have so much going on today, unless you maybe live in Utah. But it's polygamy was present. There were 2 wives that Jacob had. One was Rachel, one was Leah. He loved Rachel, but she wasn't pregnant with any children. And she cried out and she wondered what was happening. And there's other twists and turns of that story. But eventually comes Joseph and even another child by the name of Benjamin. But Joseph, of the favored wife, is the favored son. And this favored son is loved by his father in ways that are once again so deep and full, but as a result of that sort of favoritism, he's hated by his brothers. When Joseph entered the room, Jacob's eyes lit up, but the brothers of Joseph were like, oh no, not again. I wonder what sort of dream, I wonder what sort of story he's going to give us today. And actually, there is this moment where Joseph receives from his father what's called a coat of many colors. And this coat of many colors became then a symbol of that favoritism. Jacob did not give the other brothers a coat like this. And if you're a country western kind of music fan, you remember maybe the song by Dolly Parton where she talks about her growing up and she was given a coat of many colors. But that was a sign because they didn't have the money to have a real good coat. So her mother made the strips of cloth into this coat of many colors. But that song does reference this story. The coat of many colors that was given was a symbol of favoritism. Whenever the brothers of Joseph saw it, they said this: our father loves Joseph more than us. Now, as I just say that, maybe you come from some family breakdowns and even brokenness where you recognize the danger of and the destruction of that sort of favoritism. And maybe you were the favored son or daughter, but you also maybe were in families where you were not the favored son or daughter. And you were on the outside and you wonder, what is this all about? And what can I do to make Dad, what can I do to make Mom love me? And your life then becomes this moment where you really have an empty heart and you try to fill it with maybe distractions, fill it with pleasures, fill it with pursuits. And the reality is that your heart will never be full unless it's full by Jesus. Unless it's made full by what Jesus Christ has done for you. We all have empty hearts. What will fill them for you? Now, as we continue the story of Joseph, we need to identify that God does give him some certain gifts, and God also gives him certain dreams. And these dreams, though, become nightmares to others. That those dreams become a moment where, as the brothers hear about these dreams. Like one of these dreams is, and you got to think about harvest time. Maybe something as big as sugarcane almost, in terms of there's this sheaf that's gathered there, and all the other sheaves, all the other kind of signs of harvest, they're to bow down to this. And Joseph identifies his as the one that's standing up. He has another dream about the sun, the moon, and the moon and the stars all kind of turning toward him. And even Jacob, his father, says, "What are you trying to say?" And Joseph, maybe once again, out of immaturity, kind of puffing himself up, and he's proud about these moments and even these dreams, but those dreams are nightmares, and at least even more anger in the hearts of his brothers, an anger that turns into plot to strike Joseph down. And so there's this moment. And you can imagine this coat of many colors person who's going to visit his brothers. Jacob says, "Will you go find out how your brothers are doing? They're out way far away. They're out taking care of the sheep. Would you go out to where they are with the flocks?" And there's this moment where the brothers see him from a distance and say, "Here comes the dreamer." And they don't mean it positively. Here comes the favored son. Here comes the one who makes us feel like garbage whenever we're around our dad. You know what we ought to do? We ought to get rid of him. He's the garbage. And there's a plot actually to strike Joseph down dead. But about that time, there's this caravan, this group of merchants who are traveling by, and they're going, "Where are you going?" "We're going to Egypt." "Ha, I got a good idea. Let's not kill Joseph. Let him live in misery. We'll sell him. We'll sell him to these traders going to Egypt, and he'll be sold again. We'll never hear from him again. He'll be out of our hair. Sure, Dad's going to cry for a little bit, but bottom line is, he's gone." And that's what happens. And Joseph is then, Joseph is sold to Potiphar. And he's the Pharaoh's captain of the guard. He's sold as a slave. And you can imagine as he goes away from his home where he was the favored son to now being a slave. He was probably wondering, wouldn't we? "God, where are you in this moment?" But Joseph is a person who is diligent, who is a hard worker. And even maybe personified this idea that whatever you do it to the glory of God. And so he works hard in that household, and Potiphar takes notice. And Potiphar says, "You know what? You have gained favor with me." This favored son now has favor with Potiphar, and he gains responsibility. And he becomes, actually, Potiphar trusts him so much, he gets to be part of that household in new ways, like a leader of that household. But just when you're at the kind of the pinnacle of what you might think is that this is finally turning around for Joseph, that Joseph also finds favor with Potiphar's wife. And she says, "I want you." And he runs away. And Joseph loses it all because Potiphar's wife says, "He attacked me." And so Joseph, who is making a stand for purity, ends up being in prison. And the life of Joseph certainly has taken another twist and a turn. He's gone from being a top of a household to being now in the prison. But the warden of that prison sees Joseph, and he once again sees Joseph's diligence, And he trusts Joseph. And once again, Joseph finds favor. So there's some privileges for Joseph, even in that setting. And he meets a baker and a chief cupbearer from the Pharaoh's court. And they have certain dreams. And Joseph knows what to do with dreams. And so he interprets these dreams. And he says to the baker, it's not going to go so good for you. But the chief cupbearer, you're going to be restored. And so when you are restored to Pharaoh's palace, will you remember me? Maybe now God will remember Joseph. But we would read these words from Genesis 40. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. When 2 full years had passed, then Pharaoh has a dream. So I want you to imagine Joseph being there in that prison, and he's just given this good news to this cupbearer. And as the cupbearer goes back to Pharaoh's palace, he says, I won't forget you. And so the next day Joseph waits, and the next day he waits, and the next day he waits. He waits 2 full years. Nothing happens. But then Pharaoh has a dream and says, no one can interpret it. And that's when the chief cupbearer says, oh, I met someone who maybe can help us. And Pharaoh's dream becomes the doorway for Joseph to move from that prison to the palace. Once again, so many stories and twists and turns. And the brothers then of Joseph, they're going to come into contact again with Joseph, because what had happened is that this dream that Pharaoh had was about these 7 good years of harvest and then 7 really lousy years, and how we are supposed to manage that. And then he sees Joseph and says, well, you must be the person I put in charge of the food. And so Joseph collects all the food during good years, and he holds it together in storehouses when it's famine time. And actually Pharaoh's household increases because Joseph's very careful. And the whole world is in a famine. That's what's described. And so Joseph's family, Jacob and his brothers, are looking and searching for food. And they hear about food from Egypt. And so what they do is they go. And there's a lot more about that. There's about finding that food in the midst of famine by going to Joseph, and they don't recognize Joseph. Lots of stories about that. But God uses the journey eventually to reunite a family. And maybe that would be the end of the story, but it's not. This reunion is not the end of the final scene for this family. And so now we come to this moment where Jacob is dying and then dies. And the brothers of Joseph, up until this point, they feel protected by Jacob, his love for the family. But as we open up once again this passage from Genesis 50, I want you to hear again these words in light of all we've talked about. Genesis 50, beginning at verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs? Now, stop on that phrase, all the wrongs. That's why we did what we did. The hatred, the anger, the plot to kill, the selling of Joseph to the caravan to go to Egypt. Understanding that everything there goes back to that moment, to being in Potiphar's household, to stand for purity and then end up in a prison. To wait for 2 years, waiting for maybe some word from this cupbearer. All the twists and turns, all the disappointments, all that Joseph had endured. What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father, they don't even say our father, your father, left these instructions before he died. It's as if Jacob says, I know what might happen, so I'll try to do my best. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your fathers. And when their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves. They don't say, we're your brothers. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. How do you measure if you're all in? Having a life of commitment, being commitment, including commitment to God, even through the twists and turns of life. Now, who do you think Joseph really sounds like in that moment? In this moment, as we hear those words, I want you to hear these words. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. The words of Jesus from the cross. A few moments really after he's at that Last Supper, that first communion. Joseph, in these words of do not be afraid, and these words of forgiveness are like the beginnings of a story again. A story that comes to its climax with Jesus and his love for us. And what happens to the followers of Jesus, people who are in this room who say we're committed to following Jesus, then you see and hear new things. That we live not in a life of fear, but we live in a life of care and love. And that we understand that that fear is what separates us from one another. And so when Joseph says again and again, don't be afraid, it's once again like Jesus who said to many people, don't be afraid. And Jesus showed care and love for others, and grudges and bitterness turns to forgiveness. So this morning, I'm going to challenge you this way. What does it mean for you to be a follower of Jesus? Are you holding fear in your heart? Don't be afraid to come to Jesus. Are you living with some levels of grudges and bitterness? Do you understand what it means to be forgiven by God and then having the opportunity to forgive others? But you and I will not have that heart unless we understand the heart of Jesus for us. That then changes how we see this world, that there's a God-shaped vision. There's a God-shaped vision that sees beyond the immediate circumstances. And those immediate circumstances are once again that might close us in, that causes us not to see God. Now, I wear glasses. I've worn them since about fourth grade. If I take these off, you are just blurs to me. And you know what it is then to have your vision restored if you have glasses, or even if you have really good vision. You know what it means to have this time where you might have cloudy eye and you wipe away something from your eyes and you can see. 20/20 vision. And because of the way it's laid out, chapter and verses, I'm going to invite you to think about now 50/20 vision. We are called a 50/20 vision where we see the promises of God. We see the promises of God at work in our lives. And I want to take you back to that first few verses from Hebrews. Joseph is commended, and if I was writing that part of the story, I might say something. Joseph loved his brothers even though they tried to kill him. Joseph forgave his brothers even though they tried to kill him. I'd highlight what he did in terms of that forgiveness, but you know what is highlighted here? Joseph, when he's near the end, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. You know what Joseph is saying? There was a promise given to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that God was giving this land to our people. And so I don't want to be buried in Egypt. I want to be carried out to go because I believe in the promises of God. See, if you want to think about Joseph's life, I want you to think, yes, moving from prison to palace, but ultimately to the promised land. A promised land where there is God's love is displayed for all to see, where God's forgiveness is key to how we live our life. This morning we have a moment where we again see and hear again the commitment of Jesus for you and for me. This body, my body is for you. My blood's for you. You can't get any better and anything more in terms of commitment than all of myself I give to you for your the forgiveness. Why? Because I love you. That's amazing grace. And that's what, once again, is what we need to carry and see in this world. So I invite you this morning, as we take communion, to understand this is God fitting us with 50-20 vision. The world might intend to harm us. There is trouble in this world, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is being done, the saving of many lives. And for that, we give thanks for the promises of God. Let's pray.